The Salt-Stained Hymnal, Chapter 4. The Heretic's Garden. The air in Joric's apartment was a lie. It tasted of nothing, smelled of nothing, a sterile void manufactured by the Aerie's straining life support. Here, 80 levels above the perpetual drizzle of the Gill-Racks, the only sound was the sub-audible hum of the atmospheric scrubbers and the frantic dry click of his own fingers on the polymer keys of his terminal. White light, harsh and clean, bled from the ceiling panels, stripping all color from the room, reflecting off the polished chrome and glass of his analysis station. A prison of purity. He ignored the tremor in his hand as he keyed in another diagnostic command. On the main screen, a 3D model of a fungal spore, the one he'd inhaled, the one that had broken through his filters, rotated in silent perfection. It was a thing of impossible geometry, a crystalline lattice interwoven with organic softness. Beautiful, pathogenic. He was trying to reduce it to its components, to its ugly chemical truth. Protein chains unfolded in cascading simulations. Alkaloid markers flagged themselves in amber. Neurotoxin profiles cross-referenced against the BCA's pathogenic database. Click, click, click. Logic, data, the only virtues that kept the water flowing. But the data couldn't silence the echo. It lived behind his eyes, a sensory ghost that refused to be exorcised. Her hand. The memory wasn't a fuzzy, dreamlike image. It was a physical imprint. He could feel the exact weight of it in his own, the impossible warmth of her small fingers, a temperature his apartment's climate control would never permit. Elia. The name was a shard of glass in his throat. He hadn't allowed himself to even think it for a decade. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the hallucination was clearer than the sterile room around him, not the drowned, bloated thing his nightmares dredged up from the deluge, but Elia as she was, 7 years old, a gap in her smile, her face smudged with dirt from a world that still had dirt. She was looking up at him, her voice not a memory, but a fresh wound in the silence. "Sing me the sky song, Papa." The sky song, a pre-deluge lullaby about stars. Salt rot. He hadn't thought of that melody in 50 years. How could a spore know that? How could a mindless fungus reach into the deepest, most sealed-off vault of his grief and pull out that specific key? He slammed his fist on the console. The spore model flickered. "It's a pattern-matching algorithm," he muttered, his voice raw. "It found a dormant neural pathway, a synaptic ghost. It's not real." His terminal chimed, a placid, sterile tone that cut through his agitation like a scalpel. The simulation was complete. He leaned forward, pupils constricting as he read the results. The data was a mockery of his logic. The primary hallucinogenic compound wasn't stable. It was adaptive, its molecular structure shifting in response to his own neural feedback during the scan. It had markers he'd only ever seen in theoretical papers on biological data storage. It wasn't just making him see things. It was reading him, learning him. The comms unit embedded in the wall blinked with an urgent Priority 1 signal, a crimson icon, BCA command. Joric almost ignored it. He was on the verge of something, a truth more terrifying than any cult. But defiance at this level had consequences. He swiped a hand across the control surface, and the wall dissolved into a live feed. Commander Gill-Racks' face materialized in the sterile air. It was a face that looked like it had been carved from benthos concrete, all hard planes and grim efficiency. The background behind him was the steely gray of a command center, alive with the quiet panic of technicians and tactical displays. Kalen didn't waste time on greetings. "Cantor," his voice was a low growl filtered through the comm system. "Report is confirmed. The Hymnals used mycelial growth to purify the GAMA-7 cistern. Mass conversion event is underway. The damps are calling it the miracle of the weeping wall." Joric felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Silas was escalating. Or rather, the murmuration was. "I saw the initial reports. The mycofiltration is sophisticated, beyond anything I thought possible. It's chaos, Cantor, that's what it is. And it changes the parameters of your contract. The whispering sickness is no longer a theological problem."
"Effective immediately. Your investigative mandate is rescinded," Kalen stated, his eyes like chips of flint. "Vector control and gamma sector is being transferred to my purity units. We're establishing a hard quarantine. Nothing gets in or out. We burn the infection out at the root." "You'll be burning people, Commander," Joric said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And you'll be driving thousands more straight into Silas's arms. Fear is the medium this thing grows in." "Acceptable losses," Kalen replied without hesitation. "This is about the survival of bentos, not the feelings of the sump-tainted. You're a debunker, Cantor. Your job was to prove the god was a fungus. You've done that. Now the exterminators take over. Submit your full data logs on the spore's composition and transmission vectors. Then stand down. You're to remain in the Aerie until further notice." Stand down. The words echoed in the sterile room. Stand down and let this thing nest in his head? Let the ghost of his daughter become a permanent resident? Her voice a tool used by a parasitic consciousness he didn't understand? Let Kalen's thugs with their flamethrowers turn the Gill-Racks into a slaughterhouse, creating more pressure, more despair, feeding the organism more hosts? He looked past Kalen's granite face at the reflection of his own terminal where the spore still rotated. A learning organism, a hostile intelligence wearing his daughter's face as a mask. "No." The word was small, but it landed in the sterile silence with the force of a bulkhead collapsing. Kalen's expression tightened, an eyebrow arched. "I don't believe I misheard you, theologian, but I'll give you the chance to clarify." Joric leaned into his own comms pickup, his eyes locking with Kalen's digital effigy. The agitation was gone, burned away and replaced by something cold and hard. Defiance. "Your purity units will be shooting at symptoms, Commander. You'll be fighting puppets, while the puppet master sits in the dark and learns from your tactics. This isn't a simple pathogen that can be cauterized. It's intelligent. It's adaptive." He tapped a key, and the data from his latest scan, the adaptive molecular structure, flashed across Kalen's screen. "It's studying us." "That's a theoretical leap, Cantor, and an irrelevant one. Sentient or not, it dies." "You can't kill an idea by shooting the people who believe in it," Joric countered, the words tasting like ash. "And you can't kill this thing without understanding how it thinks. Your quarantine won't hold. Your fire won't be enough. It's already inside the walls. It's inside me. My investigation is not over. It's more critical than ever." Kalen's face was a mask of incredulous fury. "You are a civilian contractor, Cantor. You are acting on my authority. I am ordering you—" Joric severed the connection. Kalen's face dissolved, leaving only Joric's own reflection on the dark screen. He looked hollowed out, his face a pale smear in the harsh UV light. He was a fugitive now, an enemy of the state he was trying to save. He had defied the only power structure left in the drowned world. He stood alone in the crushing, manufactured silence of the Aerie. But for the first time in years, he wasn't truly alone. A lullaby echoed in his mind, a sweet and terrifying promise. The hunt was no longer professional. It was an exorcism. The connection to Kalen's comm channel had severed with a sterile click, leaving Joric in a silence that felt heavier than sound. His apartment in the Aerie was a monument to purity-white polymer walls that never stained, air scrubbed to an ozone tang, a single pane of pre-deluge glass offering a view of nothing but the perpetual swirling gray of the upper smog layer. It was a cage designed to feel like a sanctuary. He stood before the window, his reflection a gaunt silhouette against the chemical twilight. The low-frequency hum of the city's heartbeat vibrated through the soles of his feet, a constant, ageless pulse. But it was a different rhythm that echoed in his mind, a child's lullaby. Her lullaby. See the little boat floating on the sea. He squeezed his eyes shut. The spore burst in the Gill-Racks hadn't just been a biological assault. It was an act of psychological warfare. The murmuration hadn't shown him a monster. It had shown him Anya's face, rendered in impossible, agonizing detail. Her small hand reaching for his. Kalen's order was clear. Stand down. Write the preliminary report. Label it a localized outbreak of hysteria fueled by a novel psychoactive contaminant. A neat, tidy box for a problem that was anything but. To obey was to accept the official lie, that the image of his daughter was just a random synaptic misfire, a chemical trick, meaningless. For years he had clung to that meaninglessness. It was the foundation of his survival. The deluge wasn't judgment, it was weather. His family's death wasn't a sacrifice, it was a statistic. But the thing in the spores, it had known. It had plucked a memory from the deepest, most protected vault of his grief and played it back to him. "No," he said, his voice a dry rasp in the filtered air. "Not meaningless." Turning from the window, Joric crossed to the room's only other feature, a BCA data terminal embedded in the wall. The orange standby light cast a sickly glow on his face. This was it, the line. On one side was his career, his status as a pure, the sterile safety of this box. On the other, salt rot and damnation, probably. And maybe, just maybe, an answer that mattered. His fingers hovered over the cool, touch-sensitive surface. Kalen had locked him out of the active case files, flagged his credentials for monitoring, a warning shot. But Kalen was a soldier. He thought in terms of direct assault, of overt commands and restricted access. Joric was a theologian. He thought in terms of loopholes and apocrypha. His credentials as a forensic theologian granted him unusual permissions. The BCA, in its obsession with structured survivalism, had deemed historical belief systems a threat vector. Joric had access to archives, psychological profiles, and census data that Kalen, in his military bubble, wouldn't even know existed. He just needed a key to a different door. Joric's fingers danced across the interface. He didn't pull up case files on Gamma 9. He didn't search for Silas.
Instead, he navigated through layers of municipal bureaucracy, through sanitation schedules and atmospheric particulate reports, burying his search query under a mountain of digital chaff. The system was old, a patchwork of decaying code. It had blind spots. He brought up the Benthos Civic Registry, a list of every soul trapped in this vertical tomb. From here, he cross-referenced against BCA service records, then against medical archives, and finally against a file buried so deep it was practically an urban legend. Accessing sub-level personnel manifest, unsanctioned. The text flashed once in angry red, before resolving into a list. The sump diver register.
The screen was populated with dozens of profiles. On the left, the sanctioned divers, corporate employees of Aqua Veritas or BCA contractors. Their pictures would clean, their records sterile. They serviced pumps, monitored structural integrity, and never ventured into sectors deemed biologically compromised. They were useless. Joric swiped, bringing up the unsanctioned list. This was a different breed. The profile pictures were grainy mug shots taken under the harsh glare of Gill-Racks security strobes. Men and women with hard eyes and faces that looked like they'd been carved from salt-stained concrete. Their records were littered with red flags: black market trafficking, ration fraud, assault on a BCA enforcer. These were the city's ghosts, the people who slipped through the cracks, who lived and worked in the places the official maps marked only with a skull and crossbones. He began to filter the list. He wasn't looking for a thug or a thief. He needed a specialist, a survivor. Filter. Zone experience, bloom deeps. The list shrank by half. Filter. Proximity logs, gamma-9 perimeter. The list shrank again. Now only a dozen names remained. He tapped the first profile, a man named Corvin. Extensive record, survived 3 years diving the deeps. Deceased. Biosignature terminated 3 cycles ago. Cause, catastrophic pressure failure. Next. A woman named Lyra. Impressive salvage manifests. Even had a commendation for recovering a critical water pump component. Inactive. Currently in BCA detention for spore dust distribution. He went down the list. Detained, missing, deceased, deceased. The names were a litany of Benthos's quiet attrition. These people didn't die in grand battles. They were consumed by inches, by rust, by pressure, by the whispering sickness. Then he saw her name, Cade Morwen. Her profile picture was different, not a mugshot. It was a security frame capture from a catwalk checkpoint. She was looking directly into the camera, not with fear or anger, but with a kind of weary amusement. A faint scar cut through one eyebrow. Her hair was shaved short on one side. She looked like she knew a joke the rest of the world wasn't in on. He opened her file. Morrow Cade. The violations section was longer than most divers' entire records. Unsanctioned deep diving, bypassing purity checkpoints, bartering salvaged tech for Cal-L, assaulting a client. But it was the other data that held his attention.
Her dive logs were a map of hell. She'd been deeper than any other active diver, charting collapsed transit tunnels and submerged substations that the BCA had written off decades ago. She had logged more hours in red zones than any 3 sanctioned divers combined. Her survival rate was a statistical anomaly. Joric scrolled to her equipment manifest. It was a hodgepodge of jury-rigged gear, a rebreather system cannibalized from 3 different models, a custom-built grapple launcher, a sonar mapper running on forbidden pre-deluge code. She wasn't just surviving down there, she was thriving. She was a native. He found what he was looking for in a time-stamped location ping, buried in a corrupted data packet from a failing sensor buoy. 3 hours ago, Morrocade had passed through a service junction on the lowest rung of the Gill-Racks, less than a kilometer from the quarantine wall round the Gamma-9 flood zone. This was the move, the irreversible choice. Hiring an unsanctioned diver was a career-ending offense. If he was caught, he wouldn't just be fired, he'd be sumped, stripped of his purity status and exiled to the very depths he sought to explore. Kayla would see to it personally. He thought of the sterile silence of his apartment, the hollow promise of structured survivalism. Then he thought of Anya's voice, a perfect echo in the heart of the plague. The risk was no longer a calculation, it was a necessity. With a final steady tap, Joric routed a single encrypted data chit of Cal Lowe's, a significant portion of his life savings, to a black market escrow account linked to Morrocade's public key. Attached was a simple message, no names, just a set of coordinates for a derelict pumping station in the lower Gill-Racks and a time. He watched the confirmation flicker on the screen. Transaction complete. He had just bought himself a guide into the abyss, and there was no going back.
The BCA data nook was a sterile coffin of white polymer, smelling faintly of ozone and chilled recycled air. It was a pocket of the Aerie's enforced purity, a stark contrast to the phantom scent of honey and rot that still clung to the inside of Joric's skull. He kept his breathing steady, a practiced, metronomic calm as his fingers danced over the cool holographic interface projected onto the desk. The ghost of his daughter's face, her small hand reaching for his, was a persistent afterimage behind his eyes. He blinked it away, focusing on the cascade of glowing orange text. He needed a guide, not a BCA-sanctioned escort with polished boots and a direct line to Kalen Rask, but a true preacher of the lower levels, a sump diver, someone who spoke the drip cant of the Gill-Racks and knew the bloom deeps not as a hazard zone on a map, but as a hunting ground. The official registry was a joke. He swiped through the first dozen profiles, his lips thinning with contempt. Corbin, Vallis, commendation, perfect adherence to ration protocols, survival rating, 78%. Notes, reports all unsanctioned bartering, useless, a company man. Wren, Gia, commendation, exemplary service record in mid-level pump maintenance, psych profile, high compliance index, a sheep. She'd lead him straight into a purity sweep. He dismissed profile after profile, each one a testament to the BCA's ideology of structured survivalism. They were all cogs, content to rust in their designated place in the machine. They were survivors, yes, but they had survived by following rules. Joric needed someone who had survived by breaking them. This was a waste of time. He cleared the search parameters, the orange text vanishing with a soft chime. His own reflection stared back from the dark interface for a moment. A man hollowed out, his face a mask of clinical detachment he no longer felt. The tremor in his hand was slight, but it was there. The spore burst had done more than conjure ghosts. It had cracked the foundation of his nihilism. He needed answers, not just a debunked prophet, and the answers were in the abyss. His fingers typed a new set of queries, words that would flag any normal user for immediate review. Filter, sump diver, grade 3 certification, crossref, disciplinary action report 5, crossref, sanctioned salvage, sector gamma 7. Keyword, insubordination.
The terminal hummed, processing the contradictory request. A warning glyph pulsed in the corner of the display.
Accessing tiered personnel files requires Level 4 clearance. Your query has been flagged. Joric ignored it. Kalen had given him the clearance. A leash long enough to let him wander, but a leash all the same. He was about to test its length. The system returned a single result. Cade, Morwen, Morrow. The file bloomed open, and Joric leaned closer. It wasn't a file, it was a battlefield, a war waged between official commendation and official condemnation. Her ident photo was a decade old, grainy and monochrome. A woman with dark, cropped hair, a sharp jawline, and eyes that stared out of the image with flat, weary defiance. A pale scar cut through her left eyebrow. She wasn't smiling. He scrolled through the commendations first. They were legendary, whispered about in the Gill-Racks as ghost stories. Commendation: successful solo recovery of hydroprocessor 7C from collapsed sublevel 9 sector Delta. Asset recovery valued at 1.2 million Cal-L. Mission parameters designated unrecoverable. Commendation: charted and verified a stable passage through the Iron Maw, a previously unnavigable tangle of collapsed superstructures in the upper Bloom Deeps, enabling 3 subsequent salvage operations. Commendation: survived 72 hours solo in the spore-dense miasma fields post-containment breach. Retained 94% of mission-critical salvage. Only known survivor of the incident. Joric felt a knot of cold respect tighten in his gut. This woman didn't just dive, she conquered. She went into places the city had abandoned and clawed value from the jaws of the rot. She was precisely the instrument he needed. Then he scrolled to the other side of her ledger. The red text seemed to glow with a life of its own. Disciplinary action, insubordination, physical altercation with superior officer, Subcommander Vrail. Charge, striking and officer. Sentence, 30 days reclamation duty, forfeiture of hazard pay. Disciplinary action, willful destruction of BCA property, unauthorized modification of issued rebreather and depth gauge. Sentence, fined 5,000 Cal-L. Disciplinary action, black market activity. Caught bartering salvaged pre-deluge data slates for untaxed nutrient paste and immunoboosters. Sentence, indefinite suspension of Grade 3S sump diver certification. Disciplinary action, dereliction of duty. Abandoned assigned salvage perimeter to rescue 2 trapped laborers from a structural collapse. Official reprimand. Joric paused on that last one. A reprimand for saving lives. That, more than anything, told him who she was. She had her own code, and it had nothing to do with the BCA's sterile calculus of acceptable losses. She was a paradox, a legend and a pariah, a hero and a criminal, the perfect guide for a heretic. He pulled up her psych profile. It was a tapestry of warnings. Subject displays pronounced anti-authoritarian tendencies, resistant to command structures perceived as inefficient or morally compromised. Highly individualistic, operates with a personalized ethical framework that frequently conflicts with BCA protocol. Risk tolerance threshold is abnormally high, suggesting either extreme competence or a latent death wish. Recommendation: unsuitable for team-based operations. Restrict to solo, high-risk salvage under strict oversight. A latent death wish, Joric thought.
or just someone who has seen the bottom of the world so many times that the surface no longer holds any appeal. He understood that. He understood it completely. He looked again at the grainy photo. Morrow Cade, the wreck of a career, the pinnacle of a profession. She was dangerous. She was unstable. She was probably more likely to slit his throat for his water rations than she was to lead him to Thorn. And she was his only choice. The world Kalen wanted him to operate in, the world of rules, reports, and rigid control, could not comprehend the murmuration. It could not fight a god that grew in the dark and fed on despair. To hunt this thing, he had to leave that world behind. He had to descend into the chaos and find a predator who knew how to navigate it. His emotional shift wasn't a wave, but a quiet, seismic settling. The calculated risk solidified into grim, unyielding determination. The path forward was no longer a branching set of possibilities. It was a single, dark tunnel, and Morrow Cade was the only one who held the light. His finger tapped the interface. Request. Last known location and active comlink for Cade, Morwen. The terminal chimed its sterile assent. A map of the Gill-Racks shimmered into view, a chaotic lattice of catwalks and repurposed containers. A single orange dot pulsed steadily in a district known as the Sumpstills, a notorious hub for black market trade and unsanctioned salvage crews. He committed the coordinates to his datapad. The download was a quiet, anticlimactic act, but Joric felt its weight. It was the sound of a door slamming shut behind him, the lock engaging with a final, echoing click. He was no longer just defying Kalen. He was officially going rogue. He was going to hire the wreck of Morrow Cade to guide him into the heart of the storm. The door to the Sump Rat's throne didn't open so much as it surrendered, groaning on rusted hinges against the oppressive humidity. The air that hit Joric was a physical blow, a hot, wet fist of unscrubbed breath, spilled algae ale, sweat, and something acridly metallic, like old blood on iron. Above it all, the sweet, cloying perfume of the murmuration, seeping from fungal blossoms that grew like mold in the corners of the ceiling, a scent like honey and rot. It was the smell of the Gill-Racks, the smell of slow decay and desperate life, and it was anathema to the sterile, ozonic purity of his Aerie apartment. He paused in the doorway, a clean shape silhouetted against the murky orange glow of the corridor's emergency lighting. Every head in the cramped, low-ceilinged bar turned. Dozens of pairs of eyes, hard, weary, and resentful, sized him up in a single collective blink. They saw the cut of his BCA-grade filtration coat, the unfrayed cuffs, the way he stood with a spine unbent by decades of hauling salvage through weeping concrete tunnels. They saw a pure. They saw a mark. The noise, a chaotic symphony of slurred arguments, the clatter of bone tiles on metal tables, and the relentless metronomic drip of condensation from a massive overhead pipe faltered for a half-second before resuming louder and more defiant than before. A challenge. Joric ignored it, his gaze sweeping the room. His own personal god, the cold logic of the mission, was all the armor he needed. Find Morrow Cade. The best sump diver in Benthos, his contact had said. The only one mad enough and skilled enough to navigate the Bloom Deeps without a death wish. Find her, hire her, and descend into the maw of the city to find Thorn.
This place was a cancer ward of humanity. Faces were gaunt, skin slick with the perpetual damp. A man with a crude bionic eye that glowed a flickering red watched him from the bar, a proprietary hand on a flask of cloudy liquid. Two laborers in the corner communicated in a series of rhythmic finger taps against a corroded bulkhead, the drip cant of the racks, a silent language Joric could never hope to understand. He was an alien here, a ghost from a world of clean water and solid ground, and his presence was a loud, unwelcome scream in their quiet misery. Then he saw her. In the deepest corner of the bar, back to the sweating wall, sat a woman at a small round table. She was the still point in the room's turning chaos. A mountain of a man, his face a road map of scars and his arms thick as conduits, sat opposite her, knuckles white as he stared at the 5 small carved knuckle bones between them. A game of grave toss. A game of pure chance, they said. Joric knew better. Nothing was pure chance down here. Joric moved, his clean boots making a distinct alien sound on the grime-caked floor. He found a spot near a support pillar crawling with greasy blue-green bioluminescence and watched. The woman, more okayed, had to be her. She matched the description. Lean build, dark hair cropped short and practical, skin the color of algae paste from a diet of it. But the description hadn't captured the predatory stillness of her. She wasn't playing the game. She was presiding over it. The big man growled, sweat beading on his brow. He scooped up the bones, rattled them in a fist the size of Joric's head, and threw. They skittered across the table. 3 eyes up, 2 skulls. A good throw. A winning throw for most. A smirk touched the man's lips. Morrow didn't even seem to register the result. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, were fixed on the man's face. She gathered the bones with a fluid economy of motion, her fingers surprisingly nimble, stained with rust and something that looked like dried mycelium. She didn't shake them. She simply held them for a moment, then let them drop from her palm.
Morrow leaned back, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. It wasn't a friendly expression. It was the satisfaction of a predator confirming its superiority. She slowly, deliberately, pushed his stack of calibrated leader chits toward her own small pile. "You flare your left nostril when you have a strong hand," she said, her voice a low, gravelly alto that cut through the bar's din. "And your eye twitches when you're bluffing a weak one. You're not losing to the bones. You're losing to your own face." The man slammed his fist on the table, making the chits jump. He opened his mouth to roar, but then he looked into her eyes. Joric saw the fury in him curdle into something else. Fear. He pushed himself away from the table, kicked his stool over, and stormed toward the exit, shouldering past other patrons without apology. Morrow didn't watch him go. She was already stacking her winnings into neat columns, her movements precise and unhurried. The sumprat on her throne of salvaged metal and shattered egos. This was the moment. Joric pushed off the pillar and walked toward her. The path seemed to clear for him, the ambient noise dipping again as the room's attention followed him. He could feel the weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure on his back. He stopped at her table, the sickly fungal light from the wall casting half his face in a ghoulish green. She didn't look up. "Whatever the BCA is selling, I'm not buying," she said, her focus entirely on the plastic jits. "And if you're a debt collector, you're in the wrong jurisdiction." "I'm not from the BCA," Joric said. His own voice sounded sterile, clipped, offensively formal in this space. "Your coat is," she countered,
finally finishing her stack. She still hadn't made eye contact. Smells like Aerie scrubbers and self-importance. So you're either a slumming pure with a death wish, or you're looking for something you can't get from your own kind. Joric held his ground. Determination was calcifying into a wary caution. This woman was a blade, and he needed to grasp it without getting cut. I need a guide. Morwen Cade.
At the sound of her full name, she finally went still. She raised her head, and her eyes met his. They were the color of the deep, toxic water that filled the city's foundations, a murky, intelligent gray-green. They weren't hostile. They were worse. They were evaluative. She scanned him from head to toe, and he felt utterly transparent, his motives and his desperation laid bare on her grimy table. "Morrow," she corrected him quietly. "Nobody's called me Morwen since my mother drowned. What's the destination?" "A laboratory, in the lower racks, near the bloom-deep threshold." She gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Thorn's little garden, of course. The Heretic." Her eyes narrowed. "That's a sumping offense for him. For you, helping a known heretic? That's an execution. Why?" He wouldn't give her the truth, not the whole truth. The image of his daughter's face, pale and smiling in the spore haze of his apartment, flickered in his mind's eye. The memory was a fresh wound. "He has data I require. A personal matter." Morrow leaned forward, the movement slow and serpentine. The sweet rot smell of the fungi seemed to intensify around her. "There are no personal matters in Benthos Pure. Only survival. A trip to Thorn's doorstep with BCA patrols sweeping the racks for hymners. That's a high-risk contract. It'll cost you more than that pile of Kal-Els you probably carry on your wrist slate." Her gaze drawn. She held all the power here, in the dark, under the drip, and they both knew it. "Name your price," Joric said, the words tasting like surrender. The bar called itself the Sump Pump, a name that was less a joke and more a statement of fact. It was a corroded shipping container wedged between two groaning support pylons, its metal walls weeping with a permanent greasy condensation. The air, thick enough to chew, was a foul cocktail of ozone from a sputtering light fixture, the sweet cloying decay of cultivated fungal lanterns, and the sharp yeast-like tang of whatever passed for alcohol in the Gill-Racks. It was a place where hope came to die, and divers came to forget why they kept risking their lives for the scraps of a dead world. Joric sat at a table welded to the floor, the rust rough and cold beneath his forearms. He was an anomaly here. His jacket, though stained by the perpetual drizzle of the mid-levels, lacked the ingrained grime and patched-up tears of the other patrons. He looked like what he was, a pure from the Aerie, slumming it in the depths, and a target. Across from him, the woman named Morwen Cade watched him with the flat, predatory stillness of a deep-sea creature. Her face was a topography of old scars, her eyes the color of silt. She hadn't touched the cloudy liquid in the glass between them. She didn't need to. She was already intoxicated by her own cynicism. He had been told she was the best, the only sump diver mad enough and skilled enough to navigate the newly drowned sections of Gamma 9. Looking at her, he believed it. Joric slid his wrist slate across the wet metal. The Cal-Lee chit shimmered on the screen, a number that would buy a family in the Gill-Racks a month of clean water and nutrient paste. 2,000 calibrated liters, he said, his voice clipped and precise, the sterile accent of the Aerie cutting through the bar's low hum. "Half now, half on completion.
I need a guide into the Gamma-9 flood zone, to the source of the pump failure." Morrow didn't even glance at the slate. Her eyes remained locked on his, searching for the cracks in his composure. She picked at a loose thread on her worn pressure suit cuff. A slow, deliberate smile stretched her lips, showing teeth faintly stained by algae paste. 2,000, she repeated, her voice a low rasp like gravel being dragged over concrete. "To walk a pure through the murmuration's newest garden. You must think I'm fresh from the surface." Joric felt a familiar spike of irritation. In the Aerie, his credentials and his title did the talking. Here, they were just another liability. "The rate is more than fair." Fair. She finally leaned forward, the fungal light from a nearby jar casting sickly green shadows across her face. "Let me tell you what's fair, sporehead. Nothing. Gamma-9 isn't just flooded, it's blooming. The water is thick with spores. The air is so heavy you can taste the whispering sickness on your tongue. Every piece of scrap metal groans, ready to collapse into the deeps. The bloomed are everywhere, walking through the dark like broken chandeliers. And you want me to take you to the heart of it for the price of a few good showers?" She shook her head, the smile gone. "Salt rot. The BCA doesn't pay for guides into Gamma-9. They pay for ordnance to level it." Her words were a cold confirmation of everything Kalen Rask hadn't said. He'd shown Joric the maps, the sensor readings, but he'd omitted the texture of the place, the feeling of it. The memory of his daughter's hallucinated touch, impossibly warm against his skin, prickled at the back of his neck. This wasn't a contract anymore. It was an exorcism. He had to go deeper. He had to understand how a pathogen could wear his daughter's face. "This isn't a BCA-sanctioned mission," Joric said, his voice lowering. He pulled the slate back, the faint light of the screen reflecting in his tired eyes. "Commander Rask wants me out. He thinks the problem can be solved with fire and pressure." "For once, the bastard's right," Morrow grunted, finally taking her glass and swirling the contents. She didn't drink. "So what is this? You got a death wish? Some kind of crisis of faith you need to solve by getting your lungs filled with mycelium?" A crisis of no faith, Joric thought. The nihilism that had been his shield for decades, feeling thin and brittle. He looked past Morrow, at the grimy, weeping walls of the bar. He saw his family's faces, not in a vision, but in the abstract patterns of rust and damp, his mind now primed to find them everywhere. He was losing his clinical distance. He was becoming one of the faithful he so despised, chasing a ghost. He had to offer her something more than survival. He had to offer her a miracle of a different kind. Greed. He leaned in, mirroring her posture. The conspiratorial closeness felt alien to him. "This is a private venture. And you're right, 2,000 is an insult. The money's just an incidental, a retain."
He manipulated the slate under the table, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. He pulled up a deeply encrypted file, one layered with BCA-level security he hadn't relinquished. A schematic bloomed on the screen, a complex web of blue lines and notations. He slid the device back into the center of the table, shielding its glow with his hands. "Do you know the Aqua Veritas Sub-Level 3? He asked, his voice barely audible over the groan of a nearby water pump. Morrow's eyes, drawn by the light, flickered down to the screen. Her professional indifference shattered. For a split second, he saw the sump diver behind the cynic, the prospector,
the treasure hunter. Her breath hitched. "That's a ghost story," she whispered, her gaze tracing the lines of the schematic. "A pre-deluge xenobiology lab, sealed 80 years ago. Divers say the main conduit collapsed in the final deluge. It's a myth, a tomb." "The main conduit did collapse," Joric confirmed, "but the myth is real." He tapped a section of the schematic, highlighting a smaller secondary line, a maintenance channel, barely wide enough for one person. It bypassed the collapsed sector and led directly to the lab's core. A single glaring red icon pulsed at its entrance. "A Series 7 biometric seal," Morrow breathed, her voice tight with a kind of desperate reverence. "Alpha grade, unbreakable. No one gets through that." "Not without the right key," Joric said. He deactivated the slate and tapped his own temple. "It's keyed to the neural patterns of the BCA's senior theological analysts, a failsafe from the early days to make sure no one could tamper with pre-deluge biologicals without oversight. It's keyed to me." The air between them thickened. The city's hum, the dripping water, the distant shouts, it all faded into a dull roar. In Morrow's silt-colored eyes, Joric saw the frantic calculations of risk versus reward. A lifetime of scavenging algae-crusted machinery versus one score that could set her up as a queen in this drowned kingdom. Untouched old-world tech, medical supplies, data cores, a legend made real.
"The Kal-El is off the table," she stated. Her voice was flat, all business. "The retainer is for my supplies and my silence. The real price is salvage. I get primary claim, 60% of the haul. You get your answers, I get the tech. That's the deal." 50, Joric countered out of instinct, the negotiator in him briefly surfacing. 60, she repeated, her gaze unflinching. "And my word is law down there. We follow my route at my pace. You hesitate, you argue, you slow me down, I leave you for the bloom. And if the sickness takes you," she added, her voice dropping to ice, "I will take your slate off your corpse and open that door myself. Understood?" Joric felt a cold dread mixed with a grim sense of victory. She was offering him exactly what he needed, a path forward stripped of all sentiment, a purely transactional descent into hell. It was a language he understood. He thought of his daughter's hand in his, of the lullaby that echoed in the quiet moments. He had to know. "Understood," he said. Morrow nodded once. She stood, her chair scraping against the metal floor. She drained her glass of murky spirit in one swallow, grimacing as it went down. "Checkpoint at the Gamma-9 sluice gate, first cycle," she ordered. "Come alone. And for the love of the deep, wear something that doesn't scream, 'I have clean water and all my teeth.'" Without another word, she turned and vanished into the crowd of weary, haunted divers, leaving Joric alone at the table. He stared at his own untouched glass, the foul liquid shimmering under the fungal glow. The deal was made. He had his guide. Now all he had to do was survive her. The air in the plaza was thick enough to drink, a foul cocktail of wet rust, unwashed desperation, and the sweet, cloying perfume of rot that was the murmuration's signature scent. From their perch on a rusted maintenance gantry 50 feet above, Joric Cantor watched the scene unfold through a film of greasy condensation. Below, a sea of humanity, a tide of misery washed up against the sealed blast doors of the Gamma-8 transit tunnel. They were the refugees from the Gamma-9 flood, the sump-tainted, their faces gaunt under the sickly orange emergency lighting.
Salt rot, Morrow breathed beside him, her voice a low whisper that barely disturbed the humid air. Never seen so many in one place. Kalen's purity patrols will be here before the cycle changes. Joric didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the center of the crowd, on the man who held them captive with nothing but his voice. Silas. He wasn't what Joric had expected. No wild-eyed zealot, no frothing demagogue. He was thin, almost frail, dressed in the same patched synth weaves as the damps around him. He stood on an overturned ration crate, his hands held loosely at his sides. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice, amplified by the plaza's unfortunate acoustics, was a calm, resonant current in the stagnant air. Classic Messiah complex, Joric thought, his mind reflexively categorizing, analyzing, debunking. Establish a common enemy, the BCA, the system. Present a universal affliction, suffering. Then sell the cure. They tell you to fear the whispering sickness, Silas said, his voice washing over the crowd, soothing the ragged coughs and whimpers. They tell you to trust their filters, their rations, their structured survivalism. They offer you a life of counting drops, of measuring breaths, of fearing your neighbor. They offer you a cage and call it a city. A murmur of assent, weak but heartfelt, rippled through the refugees. Joric felt Morrow shift beside him. He's not wrong, she muttered. He's selling an opioid, Joric whispered back, his eyes narrowing. He's telling a drowning man not to fear the water. Down below, Silas smiled, a sad, knowing expression. The Benthos Consolidation Authority offers you survival. But what is survival without peace? What is a beating heart in a body that aches with loss? Look at yourselves. You have lost your homes. You have lost your kin. You carry your past like a lead weight in your gut. This is the pain of the self, a cold, lonely room where you sit with your ghosts. Joric's jaw tightened. Ghosts. The word landed like a stone in his own gut. He could almost feel the phantom weight of his daughter's hand in his, a memory so sharp it was a physical pain. He's using standard cult rhetoric, isolation, alienation, trauma bonding, textbook. But it was working. The crowd leaned in, a forest of weary heads tilting towards him. The desperate hope in their eyes was beginning to solidify into something else. Reverence. The murmuration does not offer survival, Silas continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, a secret shared with 1,000 souls. It offers release. It knows your ghosts. It knows your pain, because it is them. It is every voice lost to the deluge, every soul swallowed by the salt. It does not want to silence your sorrow. It wants you to let it join the choir. He raised a hand, not in a gesture of power, but of invitation. Joric followed his gaze to a massive support column where a vast curtain of mycelium pulsed with a gentle, greasy, blue-green light. It was beautiful, in a cancerous sort of way. As Silas spoke, the light seemed to brighten, to throb in time with the cadence of his words. A woman at the front of the crowd, her face a mask of grief, took a hesitant step forward. She was clutching a small, crudely carved wooden toy. "My boy," she sobbed, he was taken by the floodwaters." Silas's expression softened with an empathy so profound Joric felt a surge of professional revulsion. It was too perfect. "He is not gone," Silas said, his voice a balm. "He is only quiet. He is waiting for you to listen. The murmuration remembers him. It holds him. Let go of the pain of his absence and feel the peace of his presence. Join the hymn and you will sing with him again." Then it happened. A small, almost imperceptible event that shifted the entire tenor of the plaza. The pulsating fungal growth on the column flared, and a single shimmering tendril of light, no thicker than a thread, detached itself. It drifted through the humid air like a spore-borne dandelion seed, lazy and serene. It floated down, down, over the heads of the mesmerized crowd and came to rest on the woman's shoulder. She gasped. The light pulsed once, a soft, azure beat, and then dissolved into her rough-spun tunic. Her weeping stopped. Her shoulders, which had been hunched in on themselves with the weight of her grief, relaxed. A look of stunned, beatific peace spread across her features. She looked up at Silas, her eyes wide with a terrifying, absolute belief. "I hear him," she whispered, the words carrying an impossible distance. "He's warm." The communal gasp of the crowd was like the turning of a tide. The dam of their despair broke, replaced by a flood of ecstatic hope. They surged forward, not in a riot but in a pilgrimage, their hands outstretched towards Silas, towards the glowing column. "He's directing it," Joric breathed, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. "That's not random spore drift. He's controlling the network." This was no simple pathogen spreading through proximity. This was a weaponized faith, a guided contagion. Gill-Racks was fighting a fire with a hammer, completely oblivious to the nature of the flame. Silas didn't touch them. He simply stood there, a serene lighthouse in a storm of broken people. He let the wave of their faith wash over him. He wasn't their commander, he was their conduit. "We need to go," Morrow urged, her hand gripping his arm. "The drones, look!" Joric tore his eyes from the scene and looked up. 3 BCA patrol drones had descended from the smoggy heights, their forms stark silhouettes against the orange glow. Their optical sensors, cold blue pinpricks, swept across the plaza. They weren't engaging, they were observing, recording, identifying targets. As Morrow pulled him back into the shadows of the gantry, Joric's gaze was drawn back to Silas one last time. The prophet's eyes lifted, sweeping over the crowd, over the architecture, and for one heart-stopping second they seemed to lock directly onto Joric's hiding place. There was no malice in that gaze, only a deep, bottomless pity, and an invitation. Then Silas spoke his final words to the assembly, his voice once more a calm certainty that cut through the rising hum of worship. "Do not fear those who come with weapons and rules. They can only take your body. They cannot touch your soul once it is part of the whole. There is no more loneliness, no more fear, no more loss, only the salt-stained hymn singing us all home." Singing us all home. The phrase struck Joric like a physical blow. The world seemed to tilt, the groan of stressed metal and the drip of water fading into a high-pitched whine in his ears. It was the exact phrase the hallucination of his daughter had whispered to him during his first major spore exposure. Exactly. Coincidence? Salt rot. It's a damned coincidence. Apophenia. But the cold certainty of his own logic felt thin, a brittle sheet of ice over a bottomless, freezing ocean. This thing, This fungal god growing in the city's corpse wasn't just a biological imperative. It wasn't just a pattern. It was learning. And it had been listening to him all along. The air in the Gamma-8 plaza was thick enough to drink, a foul cocktail of recycled oxygen, wet metal, and the cloying honey-rot perfume of the murmuration. From my position near the back of the crowd, I watched the prophet Silas. He stood on a makeshift dais of rusted deck plating, a frail figure haloed by the greasy orange of a single emergency light. He was nothing physically, thin, draped in the same patch synth weaves as his flock, but his voice was a masterpiece of control. It carried over the ever-present drip of condensation and the low, somatic hum of the city's heartbeat, weaving a narrative of release, of belonging. "The authority offers you structured survival," Silas said, his voice a balm. "They offer you rationed water, filtered air, a slow gray death in a cage of their own making. They call it life. I call it a slow drowning." A murmur of assent rippled through the gathered damps. Hundreds of them packed shoulder to shoulder in the damp chill. Their faces, pale under the emergency lighting, were traced with the faint, sickly green bioluminescence of early-stage infection, the whispering sickness. To them it was a mark of grace. To me, it was the clinical signature of a pathogen hijacking the human nervous system. I catalogued it with cold detachment. Pathogen, host, vector. Nothing more. "The murmuration does not offer survival," Silas said, his arms spreading wide, a gesture of embrace that encompassed the entire weeping plaza. "It offers an end to suffering. It offers a voice to the voiceless, a connection to the lost. It offers reunion. Reunion." The word was a scalpel expertly slid between my ribs. I felt a familiar phantom ache, the ghost of a small hand in mine. I pushed it down, burying it under layers of clinical observation. Look at them, their rapt expressions, their parted lips. This wasn't faith, it was desperation given a name, an opiate for the masses as old as humanity itself. And I was the physician sent to diagnose the disease and cut it out. Then came the sound.
It wasn't a noise that arrived through the ears. It started lower, deeper. A vibration that traveled through the soles of my boots, up my spine, and settled in my teeth. It was the groan of a dying leviathan. The sound of pre-deluge plasteel, stressed beyond its 80-year tolerance, finally surrendering to the crushing weight of the sea above.
I was caught in the current, my body propelled backward, away from the tunnel. My training screamed at me to find cover, to get low, to brace against a support column. But there was nowhere to go. We were a bottleneck of flesh, trapped between the failing bulkhead and the narrow causeways that led back to the Gill-Racks. The groan of the tunnel was now a continuous, deafening roar, punctuated by sharp cracks, like immense bones snapping. "Move! Get back!" I yelled, the words lost in the bedlam. A heavy support beam, thick as my torso, visibly twisted. Its bolts sheared off with a series of reports like cannon fire, each one sending a fresh wave of panic through the mob. The great arch of the tunnel began to sag in the middle, a weeping fissure cracking its way across the concrete seal. Water, black and greasy, began to piss out of it, then gush. Salt rot. The whole thing was going to blow. I braced myself against the surge, planting my feet, fighting to stay upright. To fall here was to be trampled into the grime. In the chaos, my gaze found Silas again. He hadn't moved. He stood on his rusted stage, the raining dust and the screaming mob creating a storm around him. But he was the eye, calm, still. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the dying tunnel. His head was tilted as if in sympathy. His hands, which had been open in a gesture of welcome, were now pressed together in front of his chest. Not in prayer, not in fear. It was a gesture of concentration, of focus. The faint green light from the fungus on his skin seemed to brighten, pulsing in time with the city's deep, pumping heartbeat. Around him, his city was dying. His followers were screaming, and he just stood there, watching the wound in the world tear itself open. The immense pressure from the other side of the wall made the air crackle. The shrieking of metal reached an unbearable crescendo. It was the end. A few more seconds, and this whole plaza would be a high-pressure tomb, scoured clean by the sea. And Silas slowly raised a hand, not to the people, but to the groaning, bleeding iron. He took a single, deliberate step forward toward the imminent collapse, his face a mask of serene, terrifying purpose. The groan was the sound of a dying god. A deep, resonant agony of metal and concrete giving way under a weight it was never meant to bear. Here, in the rusted guts of the old city's transit network, the god was Benthos itself, and its death rattle echoed in the enclosed space of the tunnel, turning the air to pure vibration. Dust, thick as grave soil, rained from the ceiling, catching in the stuttering orange flashes of emergency strobes. Panic was a physical thing, a wave of hot, damp bodies and sharp elbows that pressed Joric hard against the weeping wall. The slick film of condensation and algae felt like cold skin against his cheek. Beside him, Moro was a knot of tense muscle, her hand resting on the hilt of the salvage blade at her hip, a useless comfort against the tons of ferrocrete threatening to entomb them all. "It's coming down, the whole section!" a voice screamed, swallowed by the rising cacophony of 100 other terrified shouts. Resonant cascade failure, Joric's mind supplied, a clinical diagnosis in the face of apocalypse. The pump failure in Gamma 9 has oversaturated the bedrock. The load-bearing columns are compromised. He could see the stress fractures spiderwebbing across the arched ceiling, each new shriek of metal birthing a dozen more. It was physics, simple, brutal, and utterly indifferent. An equation of mass and gravity that was rapidly being solved. But the damps trapped here with them weren't seeking an equation. They were seeking a savior. The crowd shifted, a single organism recoiling from the point of imminent collapse, and in the space it created, a path cleared. As if drawn by a tide Joric couldn't feel, the people parted to reveal a single still point in the chaos. Silas. The prophet stood with his back to the most grievously wounded section of the wall, where a slab of plasteel cladding had peeled away to reveal the bleeding, rusted rebar within. He wasn't looking at the ceiling. He was looking at his flock, his face a mask of serene, almost sorrowful compassion. His worn scavenger leathers were no different from anyone else's, but in the frantic, strobing light he seemed to absorb the chaos, leaving only calm in his wake. "He'll save us," a woman sobbed near Joric, her knuckles white as she clutched a dirty scrap of cloth. "The hymn will save us."
"Salt rot," Moro breathed, her voice a gravelly rasp by Joric's ear. "They're going to get us all killed, waiting for a ghost story." Joric didn't answer. He watched Silas, his forensic theologian's mind cataloging every detail, searching for the trick. He's a focal point for their mass hysteria. He'll offer a prayer, a comforting lie as the roof caves in, a classic martyr play. Another groan, deeper this time, punctuated by the sharp crack of rock. The floor beneath them shuddered. The screaming intensified. People fell to their knees, not in despair, but in supplication. They were praying to Silas. Silas closed his eyes, taking a slow, deep breath, as if savoring the ozone tang of imminent death. Then he turned, calm and deliberate, and approached the groaning wall. He moved not like a man walking to his execution, but like an artisan approaching his work. He raised his hands and placed them flat against the cold, vibrating concrete. His fingers splayed across a network of cracks, oozing brackish water. Here it comes, Joric thought, a familiar cynicism, his only shield. The final, useless platitude. But Silas said nothing. For a heartbeat, the only sounds were the dying tunnel and the weeping of the faithful. Then came the light. It started as a faint, sickly green pulse under his palms, the color of the deepest bloom-deep's bioluminescence. Joric's eyes narrowed. A chemical catalyst? Phosphorescent paste smeared on his hands? He searched for the mechanism, the cheap trick behind the stage magic. But the light didn't just glow, it grew. From the tips of Silas's fingers, impossibly fine threads of mycelium erupted, glowing with that same ethereal green-blue light. They were not spreading over the surface, they were plunging into it. The strands, thin as spun glass, bored directly into the hairline fractures of the concrete, weaving through the microscopic fissures with terrifying speed and intelligence. The low hum of the city's heartbeat seemed to fade, replaced by a new sound, a soft, fibrous growing noise, like the rustle of a million tiny roots. The sweet, cloying scent of fungal blossoms, of honey and rot, flooded the tunnel, thick and suffocating. Joric felt it coat his tongue, a taste of the divine and the profane. The spores were thick in the air now, a visible, shimmering haze in the new, steady light.
Wherever the mycelial network touched, the structure was transformed. The glowing veins wrapped around the exposed rebar, which sizzled and smoked as the fungus secreted a calcifying enzyme, bonding to the rust, reinforcing it, making it stronger than it had ever been. The web of light spread wider, faster, a living kintsugi of light and flesh repairing the broken body of the tunnel. It crawled up the walls and across the ceiling, a silent, disciplined army conquering the decay. And then, the most impossible thing. The groaning stopped. It wasn't a gradual fading, it was an abrupt cut. One moment the tunnel was screaming its death agony, the next there was a profound, tomb-like silence. The shuddering ceased, the rain of dust ended. The emergency strobes, no longer needed, seemed to give up, their orange flashes dying out one by one, leaving only the gentle, pulsating blue-green glow of the mycelial lattice that now covered half the tunnel. No one screamed, no one cheered. The panic had been cauterized, replaced by an emotion far heavier, far more profound: awe. The woman who had been sobbing now stared, tears tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks, her mouth agape. One by one, the entire crowd sank to their knees, their movements slow, synchronized, a mass genuflection in the face of undeniable power. They weren't looking at the stabilized tunnel. They were looking at Silas, whose hands were still pressed against the wall, his body the conduit for this impossible act of creation. Muro let out a breath she'd been holding for an eternity. "By the salt," she murmured, her voice stripped of all its usual bravado. She wasn't looking at Silas with faith, but with the terrified reverence a scavenger holds for a predator she cannot possibly comprehend. Joric remained standing, a lone pillar of disbelief in a church of new converts. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. His mind raced, cycling through xenobotany, structural engineering, mycology, grasping for an explanation that didn't require him to kneel. Symbiotic reinforcement? A genetically engineered organism keyed to his biosignature? A species that feeds on electrical potential in stressed materials? The theories were wild, desperate, and utterly insufficient.
He had come here to debunk a charlatan, to expose a pathogen masquerading as a god. But what he had just witnessed was not a symptom of a disease. It was an act of deliberate, intelligent, and large-scale environmental engineering. This wasn't a miracle of faith. It was a miracle of biology. And in Benthos, a world built on the slow, grinding failure of man-made systems, that was a far more terrifying and far more potent form of godhood. The air in BCA Central Command tasted of chilled, recycled oxygen and the faint ozone tang of overworked scrubbers, the sterile breath of the Aerie. It was the scent of control, of order, and Commander Kalen Rask was breathing it in like a man about to drown. His world was a grid of light and data. Hollow schematics of Benthos hung like ghosts in the air, their blue lines tracing the city's arteries. Data streams scrolled down polished black surfaces, reporting pump pressures, atmospheric spore counts, and ration allocations with cold, mathematical certainty. But Kalen's attention was fixed on the one screen that defied all metrics, the primary surveillance feed from Cistern Gamma 9. It was a chaotic mosaic of sickly greens and greasy blues, a scene rendered through a dozen low-light drone cameras. He saw the damps, hundreds of them, their gaunt faces upturned, bathed in the unholy, phosphorescent glow of the murmuration. They were packed onto the rusted catwalks ringing the massive water reservoir, a space that should have been empty save for maintenance crews. Their hands were raised, not in protest, but in worship. Kalen's jaw was a knot of stone. He wasn't seeing a congregation. He was observing a contamination event, a hostile biological agent hijacking critical city infrastructure. On the main feed, the camera zoomed, pushing through the humid air to focus on the water's surface. Thick, glowing ropes of mycelium, like luminous veins, had woven themselves through the cistern's primary filtration grate. They pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic light, and where they touched the sludgy gray water, the liquid around them cleared. Purity sensors, displayed in an overlay at the corner of the screen, flickered from amber to a brilliant, impossible green. A miracle.
He felt a tremor of fury vibrate up his spine. It was an elegant, insidious act of war. It didn't break his systems, it co-opted them. It offered his citizens the one thing the BCA rationed with an iron fist: purity. And it asked only for their minds in return. "Commander?" The voice was quiet, hesitant. Officer Varron stood a respectful 2 paces from his command console, her face pale in the screen's glow. She held a data slate but didn't offer it. "Sir, we're collating the reports. The event has triggered a mass conversion. We estimate over 2,000 new adherents in the last hour alone. They're calling it the cleansing hymn." Kalen didn't turn. His eyes remained locked on the feed, watching a mother dip a cup into the glowing water and give it to her child to drink. A wave of revulsion, cold and sharp, washed through him. "It's not a hymn, officer," he said, his voice a low, controlled rasp. "It's a recruitment vector, a biological weapon disguised as scripture." "But the water, sir. Our own sensors confirm it. It's registering at 98.6% potable. That's Aerie grade." Varen's professional composure was fraying at the edges. She was an engineer, a woman of data, and the data was sacrilege. "The fungus is a filter." "Yes, an efficient one," Kalen conceded, the words tasting like acid. "It purifies the water to make its own spore slurry more palatable to the host. It's feeding them poison from a clean cup. Don't mistake a calculated act of propagation for benevolence." He watched as the prophet Silas waded into the knee-deep water at the cistern's edge. The man was a specter, his skin webbed with faint, glowing patterns. He raised his arms and a new sound began to filter through the command center's high-fidelity speakers. A low, resonant hum, a chant. The sound was the antithesis of everything the Aerie represented. It wasn't the hum of machinery, the click of a relay, or the measured tone of a system alert. It was organic, human. A unified chorus of hope that sounded to Kalen like the screech of failing metal. It was the sound of his control slipping, one soul at a time. This was how systems failed, not with a bang or a breach, but with a song that promised a better way, a lie that felt warmer than the truth. He could feel the eyes of his command staff on him. They were waiting for the logical, structured response, the protocol. But the protocol manuals had no entry for a god that could weaponize a water supply. The chanting grew louder, a wave of sound that seemed to press in on the sterile silence of the room. He saw his own reflection in the dark screen, a rigid silhouette against the pulsating, chaotic light of the cult. The city he fought to keep alive with logic and steel was being seduced by a glowing mold. The sheer, irrational absurdity of it was a physical pressure behind his eyes. Frustration boiled into something colder, denser, rage. The back of his gloved fist met the console. Chrock! The sound was like a gunshot in a library. Data streams flickered. Varen flinched, her data slate clattering to the deck. The chanting from the speakers was the only other sound. For a long moment, Kalen just stood there, his hand pressed against the unyielding surface, knuckles white. The tremor was gone, replaced by a terrible, crystalline stillness. He straightened up slowly, turning his back on the screen. His face was a mask of placid fury. He looked at Varen, then swept his gaze across the stunned faces of his officers. "Officer Varen," he said. The calm in his voice was more frightening than any shout. "Pick that up." She scrambled to retrieve the slate, her hands shaking. "Get me a direct link to Purity Enforcement Command," he ordered, his voice dropping into a near whisper, forcing them all to lean in. "Commander Joric, now." A junior officer's fingers flew across a console. A moment later, a flat, synthesized voice announced, "Channel open, Commander." Kalen leaned toward the comm pickup, his eyes hollow.
Jurel. It's Rask. I am invoking Protocol 74 Alpha. Full operational command of purity enforcement is transferred to me, effective immediately. Your confirmation is a formality. He didn't wait for one. You will mobilize every available unit, 1st, 3rd, and 5th Battalions. Your objective is Sector GAMA-9. Establish a hard cordon. I want every access point, maglev tunnels, service vents, catwalks, sealed and barricaded. Nothing gets in, and nothing gets out. He paused, letting the weight of the order settle in the silent room. Sealing an entire residential sector was a death sentence for tens of thousands.
Once the cordon is established, he continued, his voice dropping to a chilling, robotic monotone, your units will commence a systematic purity sweep, grid by grid, starting with the perimeter and collapsing inward toward the cistern. Standard sterilization protocols are authorized for any and all non-compliant individuals or compromised infrastructure. The operational goal is not containment. It is excision. He stood straight, his gaze sweeping over his command staff one last time. He was no longer just a commander, he was a surgeon. And the city had a cancer. The cure would be brutal, but the alternative was systemic death. We will cut this rot out of Benthos, he finished softly, even if we have to take the limb with it. The air in BCA Central Command was a lie. It was cold, sterile, and tasted of ozone from the overworked server banks that lined the curved walls. A constant low-frequency hum vibrated through the polymer floor, the city's heartbeat, rendered as a dispassionate thrum. Here, 80 levels above the rot and the drip, Commander Kalen Rask could almost believe in the doctrine of structured survivalism. Here, chaos could be reduced to data. He stood before the primary holotable, a shimmering three-dimensional schematic of Benthos suspended in the gloom. The city was a tiered wedding cake of despair, its structural columns plunging into the unseen, submerged bloom deeps. But his focus was on the mid-levels, the Gill-Racks, specifically Gamma-9. On the map it was a cancer, a sickly bioluminescent green that pulsed with a rhythm alien to the city's hum. The infection, the whispering sickness, the murmuration. It had breached the initial containment cordons 2 cycles ago. Now its tendrils were creeping, pixel by pixel, into adjacent sectors, Hestia 4, TRI-TON 6, an unstoppable stain on the clean datascape. His jaw was a knot of rigid muscle. His reflection, pale and sharp, stared back from the holotable's dark surface. He saw the cold logic in his own eyes. Sentiment was a pathogen. Hope was a vector for disease. This was a surgical necessity. With a slow, deliberate motion, his fingers ghosted over the glowing map. He drew a line, a stark, brutal perimeter of crimson light that sliced through hab blocks, transit lines, and maintenance conduits. It wasn't a neat circle. It was a jagged wound drawn along lines of tactical advantage, sealing off 3 major sectors completely.
Commander? The voice was young, hesitant. Analyst Valerius, top of his class at the Aerie Academy, which meant he was smart and utterly unprepared for the reality of Benthos.
Kalen didn't look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the red line. Report. Sir, the population density inside the proposed perimeter. Valerius trailed off, his voice thin. He gestured to a data slate in his trembling hand. The latest census data indicates 280,742 registered residents, not counting the undocumented. They are no longer residents, analyst, Kalen said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. They are an acceptable loss. He could feel the shock radiate from the half-dozen technicians arrayed at their consoles around him. The quiet clicks of their keyboards stuttered. For a moment, the only sound was the omnipresent hum of the city. Valerius took a half-step forward, a foolish, brave act. Commander Rask, with respect, that's a death sentence. We'd be sealing them in with the sickness. No access to filtration, no nutrient paste deliveries. It would be a slaughter. Kalen finally turned, his gaze sweeping over the young man. He saw the faint sheen of sweat on Valerius's brow, the moral horror in his eyes. He saw weakness, the kind of weakness that had allowed the final deluge, the kind of weakness that whispered sweet lies about compassion while the waters rose. His own rage was not hot, but a diamond-hard point of focused pressure in his chest. What you call a slaughter, analyst, Kalen's voice dropped, becoming a precise, cutting instrument. I call triage. The organism that is benthos has a gangrenous limb, a limb that is actively trying to kill the rest of the body. We do not reason with gangrene, we do not negotiate with it. We amputate it, or we all die. He turned back to the hollow table, dismissing the analyst and his naive ethics with the motion. He tapped a control icon on the table's edge. Communications, patch me through to all perimeter enforcement squads, Alpha, Delta, and Echo teams. A tinny burst of static filled the room, followed by the clipped acknowledgments of squad leaders. Kalen's posture was ramrod straight, his hands clasped behind his back. He was an avatar of cold, hard necessity. Execute Protocol Citadel. The words dropped into the sterile air like stones into a deep well. Valerius audibly inhaled. It was a contingency plan of last resort, a protocol so brutal its existence was a classified secret outside this room. Robotic authorization. Rask. Kalen. Commander. BCA Enforcement Division. Voice print confirmed. Protocol Citadel is now active. The hollow table's synthesized voice was chillingly calm. The crimson line on the map solidified, no longer a suggestion, but an immutable fact. Access corridors on the schematic flashed from green to a solid, warning amber. Remote bulkheads, dormant for decades, slammed shut in the Gill-Racks below. A series of deep, resonant booms echoed up through the city's structure, felt more as a vibration in the teeth than a sound. The designated sectors, Gamma 9, Hestia 4, Triton 6, are now classified as Purity Hazard Zone 01, Kalen continued, his voice overriding the distant impacts. The wall is up. Nothing gets in. Nothing gets out. Commander, rules of engagement. A voice crackled over the comms, hesitant. This was the final nail, the bureaucratic seal on the tomb. Kalen looked at the pulsing green stain on the map, the life he was extinguishing for the sake of the whole. He felt nothing but the grim satisfaction of a difficult equation finally solved. Rules of engagement are terminal. Any individual attempting to breach the perimeter from either side is to be considered a Grade 1 biothreat. Use of lethal force is authorized and mandated. Confirm.
There was a beat of static-laced silence. Then one by one the confirmations came back. Delta confirmed. Echo confirmed. Alpha, Psi, confirmed. A new window blinked open on the main screen, a live feed from a security drone near checkpoint DELTA-7. The image was grainy, washed in the orange of emergency lighting. A crowd of damps, panicked by the sudden sealing of the bulkheads, was surging against the newly established perimeter. They were shouting, their faces masks of terror and confusion. Men, women, children. Automated defense turrets, sleek and black, descended from ceiling alcoves. Red targeting lasers danced across the crowd. Valerius made a small, choked sound. "Salt rot, Commander, they're just civilians."
Kalen didn't watch. He had already turned away, picking up a data pad from a console. He swiped the screen, bringing up logistical reports on water reclamation rates. The screams from the comms feed were about to begin, but he was already focused on the next problem. The amputation was complete. Now he had to ensure the patient survived the shock. The bar was a rust-eaten shipping container wedged between two weeping support pillars, called the sump pump, with a total lack of irony. The air was thick enough to drink, a cocktail of cheap algae distillate, the ozone tang of a flickering neon sign, and the ever-present smell of damp metal and rot. From somewhere above, a steady metronomic drip struck a puddle on the floor, a constant reminder of the city's slow, inevitable decay. It was a sound Joric used to find maddening. Now it was just part of the heartbeat, the groan and sigh of Bentos breathing its last. He stared into the murky amber of his glass, the liquid inside little more than fermented algae paste. His hand was steady, a small victory, but the tremor was still there, deep in his bones. He could still see her, Liana, her small hand in his, the impossible warmth of it, the specific pattern of freckles on her nose. A phantom limb, an amputated memory the spores had decided to regrow. It wasn't real. It was a symptom, a sophisticated chemical attack on his synapses. He repeated the words to himself, a faithless prayer against a god he refused to acknowledge. Across the pitted metal table, Moro Cade watched him over the rim of her own glass. She was all sharp angles and pragmatic indifference, her gear stained with the faint, greasy bioluminescence of the bloom deeps. She hadn't said a word about his near collapse back in the cistern, the way he'd scrambled back from the spore burst like a man who'd seen a ghost. She didn't have to. It was written in the quiet calculation in her eyes. She was assessing a tool, weighing its stability against its utility and its price. "So," she said, her voice a low rasp that cut through the bar's murmur. 2,000 cals to get you through the sump drains to Thorne's last known sector. You pay for your own filters, you carry your own gear, and if you start whispering hymns to the glowing bits, I leave you for the rot."
Joric nodded, not trusting his voice. 2,000 calibrated liters was exorbitant, enough to keep a family in the Gill-Racks hydrated for a cycle. It didn't matter. The numbers felt abstract, weightless. His entire account was filled with blood money from the BCA, cals paid to him for dismantling hope. What better way to spend it than on this? The final, definitive desecration. Before he could answer, a harsh chime cut through the room. The low conversations guttered and died.
Every eye in the sump pump turned towards a grimy monitor bolted above the bar. The screen flickered, resolving into the crisp, severe sigil of the Benthos Consolidation Authority. The face that appeared was sterile, impassive, and brutally familiar. Commander Kalen Rask. His image was clean, a stark contrast to the moisture-streaked screen. He looked like he'd been carved from Aerie polymer, his features sharp and devoid of empathy. An automated official tone began to speak, the voice stripped of all humanity. By order of the Benthos Consolidation Authority, Sector Gamma 9 and all adjacent Gill-Racks sublevels are now under Level 4 pathogenic quarantine. Unauthorized movement between sectors is prohibited. All citizens are to remain within their designated HAB units until purity sweeps are complete. The camera pulled back to show Rask standing before a tactical map of the Gill-Racks, Joric's current location blinking in angry orange. The antechamber where he'd been exposed, the cistern where he'd seen the impossible. The quarantine zone was a cage, and he was inside it. This measure is enacted to contain the spread of the whispering sickness and counter the actions of bioterrorist elements. The voice paused, the silence in the bar absolute, save for the constant drip. BCA enforcers are authorized to engage any individual violating quarantine protocols. Lethal force is sanctioned. Stay dry. Stay compliant. The BCA sigil flashed once more. Then the screen reverted to a glitchy advertisement for algae paste. The sound of the bar did not return. The patrons, sump divers, scavengers, pump jockeys, stared at the screen, then at their drinks, then at nothing. This wasn't a warning. It was a death sentence for anyone caught in the wrong place. And they were all in the wrong place.
Moreau set her glass down with a soft, deliberate click. She didn't look scared. She looked annoyed. She looked like a predator whose hunting ground had just been set on fire. Well, she breathed, the word a plume of vapor in the humid air. Salt rot. She turned her gaze back to Joric. The calculation in her eyes was gone, replaced by the hard glint of tempered steel. The deal's off. Joric's heart seized, not from fear of the enforcers, but of being trapped. Trapped here, with his daughter's ghost clawing at the inside of his skull. No, we had an agreement. We had an agreement to navigate sump drains, Aerie boy, she corrected him, leaning forward. Her voice dropped, a conspiratorial rasp meant only for him. We did not have an agreement for me to guide a spooked pure through an active BCA kill zone. My price was for risk, the risk just multiplied by a factor of 10. He could see the logic. It was the brutal, simple arithmetic of survival that governed everything in the Gill-Racks. His Aerie-trained mind appreciated its elegance, even as his obsession screamed against it. He needed her. Without a guide, he was just another body waiting for a BCA patrol or a structural collapse. He needs to get to Thorn. He needs the truth, so he can kill it. Name the new price, he said. The words came out strained, tight. Moreau studied his face, searching for the breaking point. She was testing him, seeing how far the desperation went. The original fee was for passage. This is now an escort through hostile territory, a combat insertion. Hazard pay isn't just a line item anymore, it's the whole receipt. She took a slow sip of her drink. Double. 4,000 cows.
Half now, half when we reach Thorn's sector. Non-negotiable." She expected him to balk, to argue, to haggle, to curse the injustice of it all. Any sane person would. 4,000 cows was a fortune, the kind of sum that got people killed for just whispering it. Joric felt the ghost of his daughter smile behind his eyes. He saw her face, serene and knowing, as if she were in on Moreau's joke. He didn't hesitate. "Done," he said, the single word cutting through the tension between them. He slid his wrist-mounted interface across the wep table. The screen glowed, displaying his cow balance. "Transferring 2,000 now. The other 2,000 go in the account the moment you get me there."
Moreau froze. Long pause. Her eyes widened fractionally. She stared at the interface, then back at Joric's face, her professional cynicism faltering for the first time. She had laid down an impossible, extortionate price, and he had accepted it instantly, as if she'd asked him for spare change. This wasn't the transactional fear of a rich man in a bad spot. This was something else, something raw and unhinged. She slowly pulled the interface towards her, her calloused thumb tapping the confirmation key. A soft chime confirmed the transfer. "Stay dry, Joric Cantor," she said, her tone a mixture of grudging respect and genuine unease. "You're either richer than a purist piss pot, or you're 10 times crazier than you look." "Does it matter?" Joric asked, his voice hollow. He met her gaze, and for a second he let her see the abyss that had opened up inside him, let her see the thing that was chasing him, and the thing he was chasing in turn. "Just get me to Thorn." Moreau held his gaze for a long moment, the sounds of the bar slowly, cautiously returning around them. She slid his interface back across the table. "All right, crazy man," she said, a new, grim finality in her voice. "You bought yourself a guide." She stood, grabbing her rebreather from the back of her chair. "Finish your drink. We move with the next pump cycle. The groans of the superstructure will cover our sound. Stay close, don't talk, and try not to look like you're about to meet God." She paused at the bar's exit, a silhouette against the perpetual greasy twilight. "Or whatever it is you think you're hunting." On one side, the BCA. 6 troopers in matte black environmental suits, their faceplates opaque, reflecting the scene with fish-eyed distortion. They were pillars of policy, anonymous and absolute, their pulse rifles held at a low, patient ready. On the other side, humanity, a tide of it, maybe 200 damps pressed against the barrier, their faces pale and slick with the perpetual drizzle that fell from the city's weeping ceilings. They were the residents of Gamma 9, now officially designated a purity hazard zone, exiles in their own homes. "Look at them." Moreau's voice was a dry rasp next to his ear, barely audible over the collective murmur of the crowd and the metronomic drip of water into a pool somewhere in the darkness. "Rats in a trap, and they're begging the trapper to let them out." Joric didn't answer. He was cataloging the scene, the forensic theologian's habit dying hard. He saw the frayed synth leaves of their clothes, the desperation thinness of their limbs, the way they clutched their salvaged possessions, a water bladder, a nutrient paste extruder, a child's faded toy. These were not believers, not hymners, not yet. They were simply people caught between a rising tide of spore-rich water and a wall of unflinching authority. The perfect raw material for a new god. The air carried the familiar benthos perfume, ozone, wet rust, and the deep, earthy scent of algae paste. But threaded through it was something else, something cloying and sweet,
he was becoming far too familiar with, the honey and rot signature of the murmuration drifting up from the sealed-off sector. Kalen thought his quarantine would contain a pathogen. The fool. He was marinating them in it. A woman broke from the front of the crowd, stumbling forward. She held a bundled infant, its face hidden in the crook of her arm. She stopped a few feet from the BCA line, her voice rising in a desperate cracking plea that echoed in the vast, cavernous space. "Please, my son, he has the trembles. The air scrubbers are dead in our block. We need clean air. We're not tainted." The lead trooper didn't move. His posture was a textbook example of non-engagement. A voice, dehumanized and metallic, crackled from a speaker on his shoulder pauldron. "Return to the designated zone. The quarantine is absolute. There are no exceptions." "He's just a baby," the woman shrieked, the sound sharp with impending hysteria. "Return to the designated zone." Joric felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in his gut. It was the same coldness he'd felt 82 years ago, clinging to a floating girder as the final deluge swallowed the world. The same implacable force of nature, this time wearing a uniform. He saw, for a flicker of a second, his own mother's face superimposed on the woman below, her mouth open in a scream the water had stolen. He squeezed his eyes shut, pushing the memory down. It was just the spores, a trick of chemistry. That's all. "They're going to do it," Morrow stated, not with horror, but with the grim certainty of a predator watching lesser animals blunder toward a cliff. "Kalen's new protocol," Joric murmured back, his own voice sounding distant. "Containment at any cost. He thinks order is a numbers game." He was right. As the woman fell to her knees sobbing, a man behind her roared in frustration. He hefted a chunk of rusted rebar and hurled it end over end toward the troopers. It clanged harmlessly off the lead trooper's helmet, sparking and falling to the wet deck with a clatter. It was a pathetic gesture, an insignificant act of defiance. And it was all the excuse they needed. The trooper's rifles snapped up in perfect, drilled unison. A klaxon blared, a painful, repetitive shriek that sliced through the air. "Warning!" a citywide system voice boomed, distorted by the cavernous acoustics. "Non-compliant gathering detected. Purity Protocol 7 is now in effect. Purity Protocol 7 is now in effect. Disperse immediately. Lethal force is authorized." The crowd, instead of dispersing, surged. It was the logic of panic, a tidal wave of pure animal fear. If they could just push through, break the line. "This is your final warning." The first shots were not aimed at the people. They were precise, blindingly bright bolts of orange plasma that slammed into the bulkhead a dozen meters above the crowd's head. The impact sounded like cracking thunder, and molten metal rained down in glittering, deadly teardrops. The smell of superheated ozone burned Joric's nostrils. The crowd screamed a single high-pitched wail of collective terror, but the surge didn't stop. It couldn't. The pressure from behind was too great. They stumbled over each other, a chaotic mass of desperation pushing toward the unmoving line of black-clad troopers. Then the angle of the rifles lowered. There was no shouted order. There was only the sudden rhythmic crack, crack, crack of the pulse rifles firing on semi-automatic. The orange bolts were no longer warnings. They were answers. They lanced into the front ranks of the crowd with sickening efficiency. A man's chest exploded in a spray of steam and cauterized flesh. A woman beside him crumpled, a smoking hole where her face had been. The screams changed, deepening from fear to raw, visceral agony. It was not a battle. It was an extermination.
The disciplined fire of the troopers cut through the disorganized mob like a scalpel through diseased tissue. Bodies piled up, forming a new, grotesque barrier of their own. The air grew thick with the coppery tang of blood and the acrid smell of burnt protein. Joric watched, his detachment a thin, fragile shield. He analyzed the kill zone, the troopers' firing patterns, the crowd's chaotic dispersal vectors. He tried to reduce it to data, to a problem of physics and sociology. But the spores in his blood wouldn't let him. They took the data and gave it a face. His father falling, his sister vanishing under the churning waves. He felt a phantom pressure on his hand, the small, trusting grip of his daughter, Lyra. "See, Daddy?" A voice whispered in the depths of his mind, a perfect echo of her memory. "They're just scared, like we were." "Salt rot," he breathed, the curse a prayer against his own mind. The massacre lasted less than 30 seconds. The wave of refugees broke, shattered into terrified individuals who scrambled back into the darkness of the quarantine zone, trampling their own fallen in their haste. Soon all that was left was the groaning, stressed metal, the hiss of the rain, and the low, pained moans of the wounded. Dozens of bodies lay heaped before the barricade. The 6 troopers stood exactly as they had before, rifles once again at a low ready, their faceless masks betraying nothing. "Zone secured," the lead trooper's voice crackled, devoid of any emotion. "Perimeter is holding." "He's not containing a disease," Joric whispered to himself, the words tasting like ash. "He's cultivating it. He's building Silas a congregation of ghosts and martyrs." "We need to move," Morrow said, already slithering back from the edge of the catwalk. "Sweeper patrols will be out in minutes." Joric pushed himself up, his muscles aching. He took one last look at the carnage below. Kyelen's sterile, brutal order. Silas's beautiful, ego-devouring plague. 2 sides of the same worthless coin. And he was trapped in the middle, chasing a third option, a truth that felt more and more like a fantasy. He turned and followed Morrow into the dripping, oppressive darkness. The rhythmic crack of plasma fire and the smell of cooked flesh burned into his memory. Another offering for the spores to feed on. Morrow Cade's workshop wasn't a room, it was a scar. Tucked into a hollowed-out maintenance conduit behind a false wall of corroded sheet metal, the space smelled of ozone, hot solder, and the ever-present damp rot of the Gill-Racks. A single naked emergency bulb cast everything in a stark, greasy orange, throwing long shadows that danced between piles of scavenged circuitry and gutted machinery. The city's heartbeat, the low-frequency hum of the great pumps, was a palpable vibration in the floor plates. Above it, a maddeningly irregular drip of water topped out a rhythm against a rusted cistern, part of the district's drip cant, a language Joric couldn't begin to parse. "This is it," Morrow said, her voice flat. She kicked a pile of tangled cables aside and hauled a hulking shape from the shadows. It landed on a workbench with a heavy, protesting groan of metal and neoprene. "Your chariot to the bottom." Joric stared. It wasn't equipment. It was an artifact of desperation. A sump diver's rig cobbled together from a dozen different sources. The suit itself was a patchwork of gray and black, sealed with thick, ugly seams of chemical epoxy. One shoulder plate was from a BCA enforcer's riot gear, its white emblem angrily scratched out. The rebreather unit on the chest was a bulky pre-deluge model, its casings yellowed and scarred. Hoses cracked and patched with glistening sealant snaked towards a helmet that looked more like a deep-sea coffin.
Its visor was a thick plate of repurposed polymer, scuffed with 1,000 tiny scratches. This was what stood between him and the Bloom Deeps, this collection of junk and hope. "It's robust," Joric managed, the clinical term tasting like a lie on his tongue. Morrow let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that held no humor. "Robust. Right. The Pures have a word for this. Death trap. We call it Tuesday. Get undressed."
She didn't wait for him, turning to a rack of tools and grabbing a pressure wrench. Joric hesitated, the sterile fabric of his Aerie issue jumpsuit feeling impossibly thin and clean in this grime-caked grotto. He was a man of data, of analysis. His tools were scalpels of logic, forensic samplers, atmospheric sensors. His body was just the vehicle for his mind. Now, that vehicle was being asked to crawl into a rusted, second-hand shell and plunge into the abyss. He stripped down to his underlayers, the humid air instantly clinging to his skin like a wet shroud. The neoprene of the diver's suit was cold and stiff. It smelled faintly of the murmuration, that cloying honey and rot scent that clung to everything from the lower levels. It smelled like failure. He grunted as he pulled the heavy garment on, the tight seals biting into his wrists and ankles. It felt less like armor and more like a burial shroud. Morrow moved with an efficiency that was both terrifying and reassuring. She stalked around him, checking seals, tightening valves, her movements economical and precise. Her knuckles rapped against the rebreather unit on his chest. "This is your life," she said, her voice low and serious. "The O2 mix is calibrated for depth and pressure. The scrubber unit recycles your CO2. It is loud, it is heavy, and it is the only reason the water down there won't crush your lungs into pulp. But the water isn't what'll kill you first." She leaned in close, her gaze intense. "It's the air. The Bloom Deeps are saturated with spore gas, not the light stuff up here that gives the hymners their little visions. This is the raw, uncut stuff. Get a lungful, and your brain boils in your skull. You won't see your daughter. You'll see the nerves in your own eyeballs, and you'll try to claw them out." The memory of his daughter's face, so vivid and real just hours ago, flashed in his mind. The parasite was already in him. What would a concentrated dose do? He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. "The primary filter," Morrow continued, tapping a dial on the rebreather, "is rated for 99% particulate capture. The backup is 95. If this gauge," she jabbed a finger at a grimy, glowing orange bar, "ever drops into the red, you have 30 seconds to engage the emergency purge. 30, not 31, or the filter dissolves and you start breathing the choir." Joric swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. His own high-tech samplers from the Erie had triple redundant systems, automated purges. This was a crude, manual death switch. "I understand." "No, you don't," she shot back, her voice like grinding metal. "But you will. Next, bloom outs." She picked up a heavy magnetized spike from the workbench. "The fungus, it breathes, expands and contracts. Sometimes a whole wall of it will just go, an explosion of mycelium and gas. It can pin you, crush you, or just tangle your lines until your air runs out. If you see the light start to pulse, fast, you find cover, wedge yourself into something solid. Don't try to outrun it. You can't." His clinical detachment, his professional shield was gone. It had been stripped away with his jumpsuit. In its place was a raw, primal fear. This wasn't an investigation anymore. It was a descent into a hostile, alien biology. He wasn't a theologian studying a pathogen.
He was a microbe about to be injected into a leviathan. Finally, she held up the helmet. Through the scuffed visor, he could see his own pale, distorted reflection, a ghost in the machine. "Last thing," Morrow said, her voice dropping even lower. "You're not alone down there. The old life is gone. The fish, the scavengers, the murmuration ate them, or changed them. Don't trust your light. Some things are drawn to it, big things, things that don't have eyes but can feel you breathing through a meter of steel. Keep your spike handy. Don't make sudden movements, and if you hear singing where there shouldn't be any, turn and swim the other way. Do not hesitate. Do not think. Just go." She held the helmet out to him, an offering, a sentence. He took it. The weight was immense. For a moment, he could only stare into its dark, empty interior. He was a man who had built his entire life on the belief that existence was a random, cruel, and meaningless void. He had sought out gods just to prove they were empty. Now he was about to voluntarily enter a world that was teeming with a malevolent, alien form of life, a place where belief wasn't a comfort, but an active, physical threat that could crush him or rewrite his soul.
His fear was a living thing, coiling in his stomach. The fear of dying, yes, but beneath it, deeper and more profound, was the terror that Dr. Thorne was right. The fear that he would reach the heart of this beautiful, deadly god, and it would look back at him with his own daughter's eyes. Morrow watched him, her expression unreadable. "You pay me to get you there, Cantor, not to bring you back. You sure about this?" Joric's gaze lifted from the helmet to meet hers. His voice, when it came, was a dry rasp he barely recognized. "Thorne is the only one who can make sense of this. I have to reach him." She gave a single, sharp nod. The debate was over. The partnership was sealed in grim preparation. "All right, then." She gestured with her head. "Helmet on, theologian. Let's go get you baptized." He lifted the heavy helm, the scent of recycled air and old fear washing over him. He lowered it over his head. For a second there was only darkness and the frantic thunder of his own heart. Then, with a loud, definitive hiss that sealed the world out, the interior lights flickered on. A low hum started in his ears. His breath echoed, loud and mechanical. Trapped. He was trapped. A crackle of static, and then Morrow's voice, tinny and disembodied, came through the comms. "Radio check. You hear me, pure blood?" Joric closed his eyes against the suffocating closeness. He was blind, sealed in a tomb of his own making, about to dive into hell. "I hear you," he breathed, the sound of his own voice now alien and robotic. "Stay dry." The air in the maintenance duct tasted of rust and cold ozone, a metallic tang that coated the back of Joric's throat. It was the smell of benthos breathing its last, the slow exhalation of a dying machine. Before them, a circular sewer grate, a meter wide and webbed with corrosion, was set flush into the weeping concrete floor. The only light came from the focused beam of Morrow's headlamp, a lonely white circle in an ocean of oppressive gray shadow. Every sound was magnified. The distant, foundational hum of the city's water pumps, the heartbeat, was a tremor felt more than heard. Closer, a rhythmic drip of condensation tattooed a steady, maddening beat against a sheet of plasteel somewhere down the corridor. Morrow was a study in contained force. She had one knee braced against the floor, her back a taut curve of muscle under her stained sump diver's rig. The end of a meter-long pry bar was wedged into the grate's lip.
She grunted, the sound tight and sharp as she put her weight into it. Metal groaned in protest, a long, screeching complaint that set Joric's teeth on edge. "Almost," she breathed, her voice a low rasp. "These old seals petrify. Salt rot welds them shut." Joric didn't answer. His job was to watch their backs. He stood a few meters away, scanning the length of the service tunnel. The beam from his own lamp cut a nervous path through the thick, humid air, illuminating walls slick with greasy biofilm and conduits that bled rust-colored tears. He was a fugitive, a sump-tainted heretic in the eyes of the BCA. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the shape of a threat. Every drip of water sounded like a footstep. The ghost of his daughter's lullaby still echoed in the quietest corners of his mind, a phantom tune just beneath the threshold of hearing. He pushed it down. Thorn was the priority. The old xenobotanist was his only lead, the one man who might have answers that weren't scripture or military protocol. He needed to understand what the murmuration was doing inside his head. He needed to know if it was just a pathogen, a sophisticated parasite hijacking his grief, or something else. That was the fear that truly chilled him, colder than the damp seeping through the soles of his boots. The fear that his nihilism was a lie. Suddenly, Joric went rigid. It wasn't a sound that alerted him, but the lack of one. The steady, metronomic drip he had been subconsciously tracking from down the corridor had stopped. The silence it left behind was loud, unnatural, hostile. "Moro," he said, his voice a low warning. Before she could reply, a harsh orange light flickered to life at the far end of the tunnel, 50 meters away. It wasn't the soft, organic glow of the murmuration. This was the brutal, clinical glare of a BCA emergency strip. It threw 4 figures into stark, menacing silhouette. They weren't the shambling Hymners or the monstrous Bloomed. Their outlines were sharp, defined by the hard lines of composite armor and the precise geometry of pulse rifles held at a low, disciplined ready. The single glowing red optic on each of their sealed helmets stared down the corridor like the eyes of some multi-bodied predator. "TACSEC." Moro froze, slowly rising from her crouch. She held the heavy pry bar in both hands, its bent tip pointing towards the approaching soldiers. It was a pathetic weapon against pulse rifles, but the defiance in her stance was absolute. She glanced at Joric, her eyes narrowed in the reflected orange light. The unspoken question was clear. Run? Fight? Joric gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. There was nowhere to run but down the hole that wasn't open yet, and a fight would be an execution. He raised his empty hands slightly, a gesture of de-escalation that felt like a confession of defeat. The squad advanced. Their movements were fluid and economical, their boots making almost no sound on the grime-caked floor. They fanned out, covering every angle, their efficiency a terrifying thing to witness. The leader stopped a precise 5 meters from them, the red dot of his rifle's targeting laser painting a small, flickering star on Joric's chest. "Investigator Joric Cantor." The voice crackled through the helmet's external speaker, flat and devoid of inflection. It wasn't a question. Joric let his hands fall to his sides. He could feel the cold weight of the laser sight through his jacket. "I was under the impression I'd been reclassified," he said, the words tight with a bitterness he couldn't suppress. sump-tainted fugitive, wasn't it?" The soldier didn't react to the sarcasm. "Your designation is provisional, pending the outcome of your current inquiry. Commander Rask has sanctioned your unscheduled expedition into the Gamma-9 reclamation channels."
The word hung in the air, cold and heavy as the grate at their feet. Sanctioned. A chill far deeper than the tunnel's damp snaked up Joric's spine. Kalen wasn't hunting him. He was using him. This wasn't an arrest. It was a leash. Sanctioned? Joric forced a dry laugh. With a tactical escort? How generous. What's the objective, officer? Or am I not cleared for that information? My designation is Warden 3, the soldier replied, the red optic unwavering. Our objective is observation and containment. You will proceed with your primary mission, locate the asset known as Dr. Aris Thorne. We will ensure all BCA protocols are maintained. He took a half step forward, and the other 3 members of the squad mirrored the movement seamlessly. And we will ensure you do not deviate from your stated purpose. The commander wants what Thorne knows. He wants you to get it for him. Any attempt to flee, collude, or withhold findings will result in immediate termination of this sanction, and you. There it was, the cage, locked and barred. He was Kalen's hound, sent to flush the game out of the forest, and Warden 3 was the handler holding the shock collar. Kalen didn't want him dead, not yet. He wanted the fruits of his heresy, Thorne's research, without getting his own hands dirty. Once Joric had served his purpose, he was disposable. The grim determination he'd felt just moments ago curdled into a cold, claustrophobic dread. He wasn't an investigator charting his own path into the abyss. He was a prisoner being marched to it. Crack! The sound was explosive in the tense silence. With a final furious surge of effort, Morrow threw her entire body into the pry bar. The grate's last rusted seal broke with the sharp report of a gunshot. She shoved the heavy iron disc aside, its edge scraping a piercing shriek from the concrete. A black circle now yawned at their feet. From it breathed a wave of air, humid and thick with the murmuration's signature scent, the sweet, cloying perfume of honey and decay. It was the smell of the bloom deeps, the scent of the god he was supposed to debunk. Morrow straightened up, breathing heavily. She glared at Warden 3, then shot a look of pure contempt at Joric. "Well," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom, "your sanctioned mission is waiting. Let's not keep your friends." Warden 3 gestured with the barrel of his pulse rifle toward the gaping hole. The red laser dot slid from Joric's chest and vanished into the darkness below. "After you, investigator." Joric stared down into the black maw. The sweet rot filled his lungs, a familiar and unwelcome ghost. He could feel the 4 cold mechanical eyes of the BCA squad on his back, a pressure more potent and inescapable than any physical chain. His descent had just begun, and he was already a captive. The game had changed, and he had a sickening feeling that he was no longer a player, merely a pawn. The abyss smelled of honey and graves, a sweet, cloying rot that rose from the circular maw in the ferrocrete floor, a scent that coated the back of Joric's throat and promised decay. This was the throat of Gamma-9, a vertical access shaft plunging straight down into the drowned heart of the city. The low, omnipresent hum of benthos, the heartbeat of the great pumps, was absent here.
In its place was a different thrum, a deeper and more organic vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the shaft, a bass note felt in the bones. Morocade stood with her back to him, her silhouette stark against the greasy orange of a single emergency lamp. She moved with an economy that bordered on contempt, checking the magnetic clasps on her harness, testing the tension of the primary descent line anchored to a groaning stanchion. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken more than 3 words since they'd left Thorne's violated garden, her silence a heavier accusation than any curse. Behind Joric, 2 BCA enforcers stood motionless. Their sealed, matte black environmental armor absorbed the light, giving them the presence of holes cut out of reality. Their helmet faceplates were opaque, polarized mirrors reflecting a distorted, elongated version of Joric himself. He was their asset and their prisoner, a duality they enforced with the stubby over and under pulse carbines held at a low casual ready. They were Kalen's dogs, and their leash was short. Gear check. Morrow's voice was a low rasp, sharp as corroded metal. It wasn't a question. Joric fumbled with the clasps on his own harness, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy under the enforcer's unseen gaze. Everything was cold and damp to the touch. Checked. She finally turned, her gaze sweeping over him, lingering for a fraction of a second on the pistol holstered at his hip before meeting his eyes. Her face, etched with the grime and worry lines of a sump diver, held no comfort. "Keep your lamps centered on the line. Don't look around. The spores play tricks with peripheral vision, causes vertigo." "I'm familiar with the hallucinogenic properties, thank you," Joric said, the sterile academic tone feeling foolish and thin in the oppressive atmosphere. "This isn't a lab, Cantor," she shot back, her voice low. "This is a stomach, and we're the meal. You just need to decide if you're going down easy." She cinched a final strap on her thigh rig. "I go first. You follow in 30. They," she flicked her chin toward the silent enforcers, "follow you. Stay on the line. I cut you loose if you're a liability." The threat was plain, unadorned. Joric simply nodded. Morrow clipped her descender to the rope, the metallic click unnaturally loud in the humming silence. She stepped to the edge, leaning back into the void with a terrifying lack of hesitation. Her boots scraped against the rusted lip of the shaft. For a moment, she was suspended over nothing. Then, with a faint whir from her rig, she began to sink. Her helmet lamp sliced a clean cone into the darkness. It did not reveal empty air. It illuminated a dense, swirling miasma. The beam caught particulates, motes of dust and moisture, but something else, too. Tiny, self-luminous specks like incandescent plankton drifted lazily in the air. The deeper her light penetrated, the denser they became. Joric felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. It was one thing to analyze spore counts on a data slate in the sterile confines of the Aerie. It was another to see them hanging in the air like a galaxy of poison, to breathe the sweetened air of their genesis. Thorne's last words echoed in his mind, a frantic, desperate whisper before Kalen's men had dragged him away. "It's listening to you, Joric. It always has been." He remembered the mycelial network in the petri dish, pulsing in time with the lullaby from his hallucinations, his daughter's lullaby. Was it listening now? Was this low hum that vibrated through the soles of his boots a form of attention, a greeting? He watched Morrow's light shrink until it was just another star in the swirling dark. The 30 seconds felt like an hour. One of the enforcers made a curt downward gesture with his carbine. "Time's up." Joric's breath hitched. He clipped his own descender to the line, the action feeling horribly final. He stepped to the edge, forcing himself not to look down, focusing instead on the thick, grimy rope disappearing into the gloom. The smell was stronger here, a perfume of orchids and wet earth, and something else, something metallic and vaguely like blood. He leaned back. Gravity caught him, a sudden sickening lurch that stole the air from his lungs. His harness bit into his thighs and chest. The whir of his descender was a high, nervous counterpoint to the shaft's deep hum. He switched on his lamp. The beam joined Morrow's distant spark, painting a vertical tunnel of corroded durasteel and weeping concrete. The walls were not bare. Thick, rope-like tendrils of mycelium snaked downwards, glowing with a faint, internal blue-green light. They pulsed, a slow, rhythmic beat in perfect time with the thrumming vibration. Veins. He was descending through the veins of a god or a monster, and he wasn't sure there was a difference. Drip, drip, drip. Condensation, heavy with contaminants and spores, ran down the walls and fell in fat, slow drops. One spattered against his helmet's faceplate, leaving a greasy, iridescent smear. He fought the urge to wipe it away, to flinch. Stay on the line. Don't look around. He descended past a transverse conduit, its side ripped open like a tin can. From the gash, a curtain of fungal lace spilled out, shimmering with a light so pale it was almost silver. For a terrifying, hypnotic second, he saw a shape within it, the gentle curve of a face, a small hand reaching. His daughter. No. He squeezed his eyes shut and focused on the rhythmic friction of the rope, the vibration in the handle of his descender. A sophisticated parasite, rewriting your brain. That's what Thorne had said. It was using his memories as a template. It wasn't real. It was an echo weaponized against him. He chanced to look down. Morrow's light was gone, swallowed by a thick layer of fog that churned 100 meters below. But the fog itself was glowing, a diffuse, sickly green luminescence, as if he were descending into a radioactive sea. That was the water level, the surface of the Bloom Deeps. Then he made the mistake of looking up. The circular hatch was a shrinking disk of civilization, a portal to a world of gray light and breathable air. He saw the two black armored silhouettes of the enforcers clip on and begin their descent in perfect, practiced unison. They were machines of the old world, of logic and order, following him into a place that defied both. For a fleeting moment, he felt a strange kinship with them, two dying ideologies sinking together. Then a third shape appeared at the lip of the shaft, blocking the gray light. A heavy, circular shape, the maintenance hatch. It moved with a slow, grinding finality. Joric's throat went dry. "Wait!" The word was a choked whisper, lost in the vastness of the shaft. "No!" A deep, resonant clang echoed from above, a sound that was both tolling bell and slamming door. It vibrated down the rope, a physical shock wave that hit him in the chest. The disk of light vanished. Total darkness, absolute and profound. His lamp beam and the two that now descended above him became pathetic, isolated things, slicing through a blackness so complete it felt solid. The only other light was the faint, mocking pulse of the mycelio veins on the walls and the billion glittering spores that danced in their beams. The sound of the hatch closing echoed down the shaft, diminishing into the depths, until it was swallowed by the low, steady hum. The hum of a thing that was now listening in the dark, sealed in with them.